Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the New Ground Life and Leadership podcast. Today, I'm really excited to bring you a conversation with my friend, Jake Goodison. Hi, Jake.
Hello, brother.
Hello. Jake is a member of my church and is a product designer, which is basically an architect in miniature. You're a consultant. You've been doing that for about 10 years, and you're a husband to Aisling and a father to Josiah, with another one on the way, which is very exciting. And Jake, we've had lots of conversations over the time that I've known you, and I love the way your mind works. You have a beautiful mind, like Russell Crowe in the film. You just go off in lots of patterns and intricacies and things that I've never thought about and never seen before. And the reason, Jake, we thought we'd have this conversation is because you have self-published a book called God's Sketchbook, where you've tried to lay out some of your thinking behind design in the natural world or created world, and design as human beings, and then particularly with a challenge for us as Christians to think about how we should be, what the sort of things we should be expecting in our work in general and in creation care, although I might not say that, certainly creativity. I'll cut some of this waffle. But Jake,
it's wonderful.
Great to have you on the podcast. I'm looking forward to our time together. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into product design, and anything else that you think is of relevance?
Well, I've never really not designed. I sort of was born a designer, in the sense of, if you show me something and say, what's wrong with this, I'll give you 10 things that are wrong with it. And then my mind starts thinking about different ways to change it. But I suppose I'd been a designer for about, I'd say, 10 years, so quite recently, before I started looking in my garden and in natural places, and just looking at it and saying, that design is like 10 times better than anything I've ever come up with. And then connecting that with my faith, which I've also been a believer since, say, the age of 21, and just thinking, okay, God designed all of these things, and it seems to be consistent. Like, we have laws in physics. When you have a law of something, that's consistency. So the God who had infinite possibility in the beginning of creation to create anything he would like in any kind of way, chose to create in consistency. Well, that reveals a very opinionated designer. And so my mind started thinking, okay, well, I have to design in the areas of form, function, material choice, manufacture, all of these things that I have to deal with. And I do it in a certain way, which has been taught to me through really since the Industrial Revolution, that we're still using the same techniques we have for thousands of years. And so I start to think, okay, well, all of this consistency, does God have a design methodology? And, what is it? And then as I started to look into it, I was like, not only is this completely cutting edge, but we're only able to imitate it in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. So this is an Esther moment for designing with God and like God and in his image. And I think that the thing for me is that we're supposed to worship God in his entirety. And there's been so little exploration of this area of God, which is the first page of the Bible. So the first page of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created. And yet I can't find anything about how he created, the methods he uses, and him as the designer of the universe. And I've got some ideas about why, but
then I guess, so we're cutting across. So just to kind of comment on, the discussion is often around evolution and design, but actually in the stuff that you're talking about, we're kind of, in one sense, ignoring all of that, because that methodology of how we've got to where we've got to may or may not be the best explanation of things. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about the fact that, given that what we have around us we can see and examine, and how it got to be here isn't really the question. It's that it is both beautiful, useful, renewable. So all of those qualities that you're so appreciating. And by looking at the created world, you're looking at that to see insights into the mind of the creator. I kind of say that to kind of premise the conversation by saying this isn't a conversation about evolution. How did God get the world to be the way it is? Was it instantaneous? Did it happen over millions, billions of years, etc.? So I say that to kind of cut it off. Is that right? That's kind of just a narrow in on what we're talking about.
I'm quite a literalist, if you like, when I read the Bible. So I read it quite literally. That's just my,
Apart from the
I
poetry.
trust Jesus, man. If Jesus says it is true, then it's true. But for me,
Those are two different things. I know. I'm really not going.
no, but
two different things. Being
just
literal
like
and believing
just
what
like
Jesus
briefly, if I go into a conversation with somebody about evolution, because obviously now I'm engaging the world. I'm engaging companies now, and I can't keep my mouth shut about Jesus designing. So the first thing I say to them is, right, I'm a Christian, and they say, well, they kind of look at me like, why is that relevant to you designing this thing for us? And I'm like, because all of the design methodologies that I'm going to be pursuing are ones that have come from God. And here's the thing about it. So as an atheist, when you look at something, you're tuned to think about that thing as an isolated item, because everything came into being by chance. So it's very difficult for you to look at the universe and see a central being which ties it all together, because it's against your worldview. But I, as a Christian, can be consistent in saying that everything's tied together in a design methodology. And actually, so it's so intrinsic to my faith that it's just coming out, and that's what I intended for it to be.
Yeah, that's what I was, I suppose, alluding to. Not necessarily how long did it take to get here, but it's the atheistic evolution that we're opposing here, which presupposes there was no willful intent behind any of this. It was just survival of the fittest. Whereas we're saying there's something else beyond survival of the fittest. There is actually the intentionality of the creator that knitted everything together so that it works beautifully and perfectly.
That's it. I mean, I think the thing that I say to people is, if I design something imagine that is the case. I have scientific problems with evolution, but imagine that is the case. If I designed something that had the software capability to evolve into something else, that's even more intelligent design. So you can't get around the problem of the software that drives the adaptations, even if that is what's happened. I mean, I think I probably agree with microevolution, because that's just adaptation. That's a part of how God designs something into an environment. So God will put something into an environment, and it will adapt to its environment. So everything that we design, I'll design like a lamp or something, and then it will go into various different houses, or I'll design a car and it will be in various different countries, and it will be the same. Whereas the way that God designs something is he designs it in seed form. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, and then as it grows, it adapts to its environment. So that's why it's able to exist much more successfully in its environment, because it's adapted to it. And it will be slightly different in different areas.
And I mean, I think your book, by the way, and it's self-published, and we should tell people how to get it, because I think you are a beautiful writer, and I love some of the phrases that phrases that you use, the metaphors, things like God is found in the beetle as well as in the Bible. It's that kind of it's re-enchanting the created world again. We have been so conditioned to think of it in terms of, quote, natural, and even just calling it nature. We had a conversation with Andy Bannister about this that's just recently come out on the podcast, and it's one of the points that he makes there, that this is creation, it's not nature. And I think that's important. What you're doing, I think, in this book is really helpful, because you're kind of lifting the lid, not lifting the lid, but you're kind of making much of God's common grace in the world, seeing that everything can teach us and points to God, and can teach us things about the mind and heart of God, which is really fascinating and beautiful. And we'll come on to some of the specific illustrations that you use that I think are amazing.
Romans 1:20, it says creation speaks of God's character. So in essence, I just finished a book by Andrew Wilson, who's I know is your friend, which is the God of all things. And he does a great job of elaborating on some of these things that God has created, and kind of looking into what it might reveal about the creator. So that really is a central theme. It is the highest function of everything that's been created, is to reveal the character and ways of the God of creation. So when you look at a bird, it's not just it's not just designed to walk, to fly, to eat. It's actually designed to reveal, I'd say, Jehovah Jireh, the provider. Like when Jesus says, "Look at the birds," they neither sow nor reap, but your Father feeds them. So my kind of highest call, if you like, is to design things that are not just solving problems, but also revealing a facet of God's nature. So that's the intention now, is to try and start aligning things as nature is. The seas, the seas and the birds and the trees, they reveal things about God. So I want to design things, and I want other people to be designing things, his sons and daughters, to reveal that nature, like physical theology, if you like.
That's beautiful. And you I don't know if this is still your system, but you talk about the prophetic, aesthetic, functionality, and the materials that go into products.
Yeah.
You said all of those together reveal things about God's design. Can you talk us through some of that?
Well, they're different facets of everything that has been designed, even everything that's been humanly designed. So you have to deal with. So, for example, I mean, maybe one of the most interesting is the prophetic. So every art and design movement follows a philosophical shift. So if you look at modernism, so the idea that we can progress, humanism, so we can progress as humans, we can go forward, we can create things that will improve our lives, etc., etc. What the design movement out of that is called the modernist design movement, and that's manifested as clean lines and everything brought down to being functional, so that we can progress. So you've got square block buildings, you've got door handles were previously ornate, now they become functional and be able to be mass produced, so that we can all progress towards this human utopia. And then you come out of 2 world wars, and people are saying, well, that failed. So now let's abandon the idea of truth. Let's abandon the idea of progression. And you've got the postmodernist philosophical movement, which we're kind of moving, I think, to the end stages of now. And what came out of that is, okay, whatever deconstructs progression, whatever deconstructs truth most effectively is what we're going to design. So we'll make buildings like mushrooms and, like post boxes that don't open, and just whatever weirdness comes out of that. So the same thing. So that's the prophetic, if you like. I'm calling it the prophetic. I really kind of mean the prophetic / philosophical or ideological backdrop to everything, to something that's been designed. And with God, I mean, that's like, so what we're trying to do there is reveal his ways and nature. So his ways and character. So like, what does it look like to design a house around Yahweh Sama, the God who is present? So you start to think like, okay, well, I would design a central room. I talk about this at the end of the book as one of the projects, a central room which is a place of worship and intercession, which is central to the family home. And then everything is based around it. And then you start to think, okay, well, I don't want to just philosophically be representing God, but I want to be representing his choices in nature because of the consistency. If I'm a designer and I make the same choice 1 billion times, you can assume that I have a strong opinion about that choice. Well, the way that God creates in nature means that the spiral on a snail shell is mathematically the same as the spiral on a galaxy. So that's the consistency of the design in nature that God has created. And so that's his choice for the design of the planet. And then when you look at it, you think, okay, so you've got, how does he design systems? By the way, everything that he does is the opposite way that we've been doing. So, it's obvious that we would have ended up in the rut that we are in. But if you look at, can I go off into the thing? Okay? I'm on a rant now. So
I mean, I'm reeling from the snail galaxy link thing.
I'm reeling every day from it.
Because I mean, I would like to hear more about that and other illustrations like that, because this is just mind blowing. Say that fact again.
Okay, so the spiral on a snail shell is mathematically the same as the spiral on a galaxy. And mathematically, it's related to the golden ratio. So it's golden ratio spiral. This is divine geometry.
Okay, so talk to us about that, those who are not familiar with golden ratio.
Yeah, so the golden ratio is 1/1.6 approximately, and it's found in the flight path of a hawk. It's found in the construction of a pine cone. It's found in the measurements of the Ark of the Covenant and the measurements of Noah's Ark. So if you divide I think it's the height and the width, but it's 30/50, you get 1.6 approximately. And same with the ark. There's one, I think it's two, but two of the measurements in the report proportionally, the ark is the same. So it's the same God who creates it. And not even that, so this is one of the principles of design that God uses. So he builds on a framework of geometry. So when I sit down and I'll sketch something freehand, right? Well, God doesn't seem to do that. He builds on this framework, which is why you get the Fibonacci, something called the Fibonacci sequence, which manifests in flower petals. So you'll only find 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. You'll only find this sequence of flower petals anywhere in the world because God's created it that way.
You don't get 6 flower petals on a flower.
Not to my knowledge. So wow. So the point is, and it's everywhere. I mean, this is like God's signature. This divine geometry, and it's quite interesting because when you have debates with an atheist, you start bringing out all this stuff and saying, well, look at the divine geometry, look at the golden ratio, which is everywhere, through nature and even in scripture, and because of that, because it's so precise and it looks like it's been so well designed, that's why you get theories like the multiverse. So basically, an atheist will turn around and say, okay, well, there's such a small probability that this universe has been created in that way, which looks so deliberate, that there must be 1 billion universes, and we just happen to sit in the lucky one, if you like, which is of course absurd. But that response gives you an indication of how much intelligent design we have and how much indication of quite clearly a structured designer. But what that manifests in trying to imitate him, which is worship, because you're declaring his worth by choosing his ways, is that we start to use software that can build things on a framework of geometry. So, instead of being random in my placement of things, I start to use Fibonacci sequence the same way as God does. And there's reasons for that functionally. For example, if you want to pack the most amount of seeds into a cylinder, so if you look at a sunflower, the Fibonacci sequence spiral, which is created, is the most efficient packing of those seeds. So, but it's incredible because it's not just there, it's everywhere else as well. But it just happens to be the most efficient packing of the seeds. It's just phenomenal.
It's remarkable. And I think because we've for so long, we've just thought, well, this is just the way things are. And so I read your book and I said to you, I think this is an antidote to Attenborough, because we're so used to just being fed explanations of things through the lens of atheistic natural selection. It actually robs God of the glory. It certainly robs me as a Christian of a lot of worship. But what it does is it detaches me from the created world, because I am in position of master over the world, and we do whatever we want with it, and whatever. And we need to be reminded, as our last podcast was all about, this is a gift that we need to steward carefully. But I think that's a product of that humanist thought of we can master things, we can conquer things. I was interested in what you said about the way that different artistic movements as well have created with different meanings behind them. A lot of people wouldn't be familiar with that. The modernist movement, straight lines, functionality. What are some other ones that come to mind?
Yeah, so the arts and crafts movement was all about, that was previous to the modernist movement, and that was all about craftsmanship. So that's when.
Oh,
are you still there?
Oh, I lost you. Say that again. So hold on a sec. I've just realised that Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I
Yeah.
can hear you.
I just realized that I plugged into the modem, but I still had my Wi-Fi switched on, so it may have got confused. So
Okay.
you say the arts and crafts movement.
Yeah, so the arts and crafts movement preceded the modernist movement, and it was all about craftsmanship. So it came out of a lot of the writing of a guy called John Ruskin, which was all about, being centered around the person, centered around the craftsman. So what came out of that is a value for intricacy, but it's very difficult to replicate. So it became very pricey. So you had massive value for, say, one item on your shelf, which was this beautifully intricate clock, but you couldn't afford, anything else. So the way I put it is that every object has a religion because it's formed in thought. So the thing that separates your modernist door handle from your arts and crafts chimney is ideology. And that's why, and I think that, okay, so in culture building, design is a very powerful tool because it stands as a massive preach. So you have the Nazis, for example, were planning the Third Reich to have lots of, they spent a lot of time thinking about what the architecture of the Third Reich would be, because it's trying to represent this ideology that they're trying to push. And it's very difficult to get away from, because you're walking down the street and you're seeing it everywhere. And it's subliminally causing you to act in certain ways, causing you to have certain values. And it disciples you. So this is one of the things that I talk about is like discipleship by design. Why don't you talk to your neighbors? If you talk, like, do you talk to your neighbors? Do you talk to your neighbors?
A little bit, yeah.
So probably that means that the wall around your house is low. But if somebody's designed that wall to be higher, then you're probably not going to have a relationship with your neighbors so much. So, a good example is roads. So you're driving a certain direction. Why don't you go off into the field and go up to that beautiful thing over there? Because they didn't build a road. So they're discipling you to go in a certain direction. So everything physical is physically stopping you. And it's the first language that you learn as a baby. You come out of the womb and you walk into a wall and it hurts.
Impressed if you can walk straight away.
Yeah, but
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they don't have language. They just know that they have to navigate the physical universe first. So it is preconditioning you as soon as you come out of the womb. And the amazing thing is that nature is representing God's ideology. It is representing the ideology of the King of the universe.
Say more about that. That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, so I think it links, his methodologies say a lot about him, I guess. Shall I just go into the methodologies?
Yeah, let's share some methodologies with us.
Yeah, it's quite funny because if you look in your garden, you already know everything I'm saying. So you've been walking around forests, your whole life. So everything I'm about to say is obvious, but it's never really been thought about to be tried to be copied from what I can see. So for example, one of the overarching one is systems. So 78 million tons of plastic waste. We produce that per year, and only 14% is recycled, and only 10% retains its original integrity. So, 40% is thrown into landfill, and that's because we have, as industries of the world, we generally have a linear waste system. So our waste system is linear. So we design products. We don't really think about where they're going to go. It's just for profit. So you draw it out of the ground in resources. You design the thing, goes to the house, and then nobody really thinks about it. You just chuck it into landfill. So you can imagine from the start of drawing it out of the ground to going back into the ground, it's a linear system. But if you look at how God's designed a forest, it's a cyclical system. So the fruit from the tree drops to the ground, it degrades into the ground, and then it feeds the roots of the tree. And that's happening through animals passing through it, dying, going into the nutrients of the ground, coming up to fruit. The animals eat the fruit. Everything's a cyclical system. We don't have any trees piled up like being a problem because they're not degrading. And we don't have any problem. And also there's a lot of throughput in a forest. So, we've been told the whole time, reduce what you're using. Well, that's not the philosophy which God employs in a forest. There's tons and tons and tons and tons of throughput happening per day. But because it's in a cyclical loop, there's no waste, there's no problem. It's positive, it feeds the environment. And so that speaks, I believe, of Jehovah Jireh. The God who provides, the God who provides from a fruit falling into the ground, he'll provide for the roots. He's created these ecosystems which are not just sustainable, but they add to life. People are rewilding areas just by introducing wildlife into it, and it's adding to life. So this is like redemptive. It's a redemptive design methodology, which speaks of the Redeemer. So all of this is, so that's the kind of systems element. If we just had that, by the way, we wouldn't have plastic in the oceans. We wouldn't have all of these environmental issues that people are crying out about. And that's the questions that the world is asking, and we have the answers. I sit down with the creator of the known and unknown universe every morning. I was chatting to him before we started this conversation, and he's created everything that's around us, all of these systems, and we have the ability to talk directly to him. So, we have a responsibility, not just for creation care in the sense of going out there and recycling and doing the things that the world is doing, but actually being the head and not the tail, because we have access to the creator.
Yeah, and I guess in the beginning, mankind was created as a representative of God in partnership with God, given the commission to rule on behalf of God. And so you can imagine that the original creator's intention for the human race was that we would steward the earth in constant correspondence with the creator.
That's it.
Learning about his methods and his way of being. Almost the garden was the nursery for Adam before he went out into the world to do what he'd seen in the garden in the rest of the world.
Yeah, so the first thing that a man connected to God was told to do was to take care of creation. So I think we have a lot of focus on getting into the kingdom, and then we kind of, when you're in there, it's like, okay, what do I do? And I think a good reference point is go and take care of creation.
Yeah.
Because that's the first thing that God said to Adam. He said, go and go and garden, go and learn about my systems, and part of the wisdom that was given to Solomon, it says in the Bible, was knowledge of birds and frogs and trees and all of these things. And I think it's about, to be honest, I'm excited because certain things have come together in church history that haven't been there before, which is allowing us to now. It's such an Esther moment for this type of thing. Shall I explain a bit?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to go off on like tangent. I've got so many things to say. It's like, do you want me to explain what I'm talking about?
Go ahead,
okay.
Yeah.
So what happened I think it goes back to the Reformation and throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. So what you have to design like God, to create like God, is you have to have value for the prophetic, because you need to talk to him. So you need to delve into that relationship and come out with the kind of revelations that Noah got, the kind of revelations that David got for the temple, the kind of revelations that Moses got for the tabernacle. That's what we're going for, where God starts a project. And what I say in the book is it actually, God with man designs backwards. He starts with a lot of revelation, and then you've got to figure out how to implement it, as opposed to starting with a problem and figuring out how to, and coming to the solution at the end. So we need the prophetic connection with God. And I think that we've had a greater value for that over the last, say, 50 years. And what you also need is you need a value for the physical.
But let's just stop this of the prophetic before we move on to physical. You're absolutely right. So what you're saying is, and at the moment we're talking, your industry, product design, talking about how you're acting on the world. But actually, this could be applied to every human being. Every Christian needs to be thinking through their workplace. And it begins, what you're saying is, it begins with a partnership with God, where actually you as a follower of Christ take seriously what that means to have a relationship with the creator of the known and the unknown universe, that you cultivate a friendship with him whereby you're becoming familiar with his ways and his voice, so that he speaks to you, and then you're able to act imperfectly, of course, but as a friend of God in the world. That's what I think it's a great kind of opening point of how every Christian should think about their activity in the world. So just wanted to underline that by restating it. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we read, like all of these precise revelations for, how to create things and how to do things in the Old Testament. And then we kind of say, right, that was for that time. God spoke that specifically back then. But we have to forget, we have to remember that the veil was torn this side of the cross. Like we have uninterrupted relationship with God that they never had before Christ. So we should expect that and some. We should expect that level of revelation and some. And the thing about it is that God, for us, knowledge is a process of gaining. So you have to gain knowledge. But for God, knowledge is a possession. He owns knowledge. He has access to every single fact or everything, best way of doing things. He has access to all that, as if he can just dip into it and pull it out. So, if I say one thing that I say in the book is that if you're betting on two engineers, right? So one engineer might have, and you can replace this with accountant or, whatever profession. One person might have 10 years of experience in that field. They might have done, that thing. So I'm saying betting on two people to achieve something first, right? One person might have masses of experience in achieving that thing, might have done it many times, and the other person is connected in resources, relationship, and revelation with the creator of that thing. The creator of everything. Which one are you going to bet on to do that thing first, to do that thing better, to solve that problem best? Well, it'd be silly to bet against the person who's allied with the creator of the universe, but that's what we are. Do we really believe that? Do we really believe that we wake up every morning with the God who created everything and has infinite resource? And would we act differently if we did? So I think that's one thing, and I think that
it's sobering, isn't it, though?
Yeah.
The sobering reality that we need to take more seriously and act more conscientiously as Christians, because you're not saying study of the kind of natural revelation of God, study it through the sciences or stuff isn't important. It's not like saying this is the matrix, we can just get plugged in and get instant downloads onto how to fly things. Is that is not God's normal way of operating.
Well, God didn't operate that way with Noah. He gave him part of it, and then he didn't go into the details of how to construct certain things. And he could have just manifested the whole thing. He could have just said, right, here it goes, I'm just going to throw you a boat. But he didn't.
Recognizing that God wants to partner with us is perhaps a good way of putting this. But what I also love is, you think there's a common grace at work in the world whereby God does this, so not just with Christians, but actually with humanity in general at times. There are some lovely illustrations that you gave of people receiving answers to design problems prophetically, mystically. Yes. Can you share a couple of them? Because I thought that just blew my mind.
Yeah, so I mean, God loves us, and there's various instances in history whereby people have designed, I'd say, with God, or God's inspired them, either in the way that they're working, so the methodology, or also receiving what I would call a tap on the shoulder from God, from the divine. So one poignant example is Elias Howe's the invention of the sewing machine. So Elias Howe was trying to invent a sewing machine, and he was failing. He had like the kind of classic James Dyson 1000 prototype things, and so one night he was kind of racking his brain about this, and he fell asleep, and he had a dream, and the dream was that a tribal chief came to him and said, if you don't solve the problem with the sewing machine, I'm going to kill you. And it was like a cannibal tribe in his dream. They were like coming at him with all kinds of spears and knives and stuff. And so in this dream, he had to relive all of his prototypes, go through every single one of his prototypes and try and get to the solution. And he failed in the dream. And they came to kill him, and they were kind of going at him with these spears. Anyway, so he woke up, and he like floods of sweats, as you imagine. And he looks back in the dream, and he sees that the spear of the tribe that they were using had a hole in the tip. And he realized that if he put a hole in the tip of the needle, that he could create the lock stitch. So it's really weird. But then you look in the Bible and it's weird. You look at the dreams of Joseph and Nebuchadnezzar and all these examples, and they're weird. So you kind of expect that, but it's not just that. I mean, you look at Mendeleev's periodic table. So the periodic table that you learn in school was given to Mendeleev in a dream. So he was trying to establish an effective method of creating the periodic table, and he had no hope. He went to bed, and literally before his eyes, these things were arranging themselves into the periodic table. Another cool one is the Einstein's theory of relativity, which is obviously the most famous, scientific discovery that nobody really knows what it means. But I mean, equally, the dream was super weird. So he had a dream whereby cows were gathering around an electric fence, and then they started to kind of arrange themselves in a wave, and the wave related to the formula he was trying to solve. So I don't know. I mean, yes, I would say that God's been inspiring, as you say, common grace. The sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous, and all of that.
Like you said, it comes from he loves us and he wants to partner with us, and even a humanity hostile to him. Yes. Sometimes he will, because of his desire to partner with humanity, will sometimes bend his own rules just to help us out a bit and give us a tap on the shoulder, which is beautiful of the Lord.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Where I've kind of entered this study, that's been the sort of end of the thinking on God and invention. Do you know what I mean? So the way people have been thinking about God and invention, and the way people have been writing about it, is that, you should just expect God to tap you on the shoulder and give you a revelation. And so we've kind of, as the body of Christ, been waiting for those instances and not even really pursuing it or trying to integrate it in any kind of creative methodology, So, but what I'm trying to kind of add to that is what the word of God is to our lives, if you like. So you've got in our daily lives, we have the word and the spirit, right? So you have the word of God, which is the defined, this is God's character, this is the way he moves, this is the way you should expect him to move, and this is what the general principles which he uses. And then you have the prophetic, which is the day-to-day tap on the shoulder, the kind of like, okay, do it this way, do it that way, and all of the revelation that comes from there. And what we've had thus far in creation, in our own creative projects, is just the spirit. We've just had the kind of these sort of stories of how in the Bible maybe, and what we expect of God just dropping a revelation to us in our sleep. But what I'm trying to say is actually the creative word is the word of God to design. I mean, the created world, is the word of God to design. That's his kind of modus operandi. That's the way that he creates, and we should be drawing from that and from this bucket. And together, really only those that are connected with God can really create like him and with him as we were intended. So that's the kind of pursuit.
draw out, so you're saying that just as in our normal lives, we think of the relationship between the word and the spirit as being essential and different. And you're saying as a creator, as a designer, you're saying you've got the created world, and then what was the second thing you said?
Divine revelation.
And divine revelation, that those two things should operate together. That almost, I said, Augustine's again, book of nature, book of God. If you want to understand God, you go to the book of God for definitive revelation. But actually, there's a lot you can learn from God and his world by looking at the book of nature. And then you're saying, as a designer, my project is I've got the word of God, the Bible, in my hand every day, but I'm also knowing I've got the book of nature open, trying to learn from that as much as I can as well.
Exactly, yeah. And you know, I think when we're looking at whether the climate crisis, you know, it might, whether it's actually a climate crisis or not, it's kind of irrelevant. We shouldn't wait until there is a climate crisis, by the way. But what I'm saying is those are the questions that the world is asking. And while simultaneously saying that we sit down with the Creator, we haven't yet really answered them, which is a kind of strange thing, right? If I have a Christian friend, if I'm trying to, you know, reduce the CO2 usage because I'm thinking in the future there's going to be a catastrophe and everything's going to go wrong because we're using the world in the wrong way, and we're trying to remedy that. And then I have my Christian friend over here who claims to sit down with the guy who created it and is doing nothing really about it and adding nothing really to the pot. That's kind of like, well, is he really sitting down with the Creator? Do you know what I mean? So I think that we have a position now to answer, and the reason why it's so poignant is because I think we have a position now to answer the questions that the world is actually asking at the moment, and we can solve it with God. You know, all we have to do is realign the rhythms of creation back to the way they were designed to be created. And so yeah, I just think that we have a tremendous opportunity before us. And so going back what I was saying about the whole having to have things in place to do this.
So we're going back so we've talked about the methodology, we talked about the prophetic.
Yes.
Are we now moving on to the next aspect of this?
So value for the physical.
Okay.
So if you look back at the Reformation, a lot of good came out of it, but I think one thing that came out of it which wasn't so positive is they had all these elaborate churches and they invested in art, you know, the Catholic Church before the Reformation, and they were pursuing, you know, the value for the physical, if you like. Now, a lot of that was bad. You know, you had the indulgences, you had, you know, people who were forced to pay for church projects, and it created a lot of beauty, though. And then I think when the Reformation came along, they said, right, there's no value in the physical. We're going to kind of throw away value for beauty in the creation of our churches and all of those things because that's just worldly. And we're going to kind of chuck that away, and we'll go for if you look at the churches after the Reformation, the post-Reformation churches and the churches of the counter-Reformation, they were very simple. And they kind of stripped it all back to say, right, it's just about the spiritual life. There's no real value in the physical. But ours is the only religion, the Judeo-Christian religion is the only religion by which the world was intentionally created. Every other type of religion, and I include Islam in that, obviously, because it's Judeo-Christian. But every other type of religion, the world was kind of created out of two giants having a fight, or like really weird, you know, other things. Ours is the only religion by which somebody sat down deliberately and created it and chose to create it physically. And we can't, you know, so God created a physical world, and we are going to a physical world. The new creation is physical. When Jesus was resurrected as a prototype to our new creation bodies, he was resurrected and he could eat fish. You know, he had holes that you could touch in his side. He was a physical being. We're going to a physical universe. There is no point in God's plan by which we abandon the physical. So this value for what God has created, which is the physical universe, which is very much linked to the spiritual universe, I think is now coming into play because we're realizing that we've abandoned culture. So we've abandoned our culture, kind of going off into our right. We're just dealing with the spiritual kingdom. We don't really want to deal with the physical or the cultural or political kingdoms of the world, because that's not what we're supposed to be doing at the moment. And we're finding, gosh, the culture's looking pretty shaky. Like our political economic systems, they're looking pretty ungodly. So now we're kind of, I feel like, from what I'm reading, that the church is kind of looking back at the culture and saying, wait a minute, can we have influence in the culture? Can we actually do something about these cultural issues? Can we have a positive impact? Can we be salt? Can we be light? And creating physical things, as I've alluded to before, is a massive part of influencing the culture. If you look at, okay, what do we have left from civilizations past? We have trinkets. You go into a museum and the representation of an entire civilization is a case full of trinkets, a case full of things that they created, which represents their values. So it's so central to cultural impact and influencing culture, that I think that we're turning back around and seeing, okay, we need to be addressing this beautiful creation of the physical again. And that's not contrary to the spiritual life. It's a manifestation of the spiritual life. So that's the kind of element of the physical that's required. And then the third one is technology. I mean, simply, as I say, we haven't been able to design like God until the last 10 years.
What happened in the last 10 years?
So one key aspect of the way that God creates is he creates things in seed form, and then he plants them in their environment. So if you see two oak trees, they'll both have pretty much the same DNA in their seed. But if they're planted in two different places, they'll grow up and they'll be completely different shapes. They'll be completely different forms. And the reason why is that God has chosen to create that way, so that when you put the seed in the ground, it has all the information for the tree, and then it takes in all the environmental forces, all of the moisture in the environment is logged. Where's the water? Where's the wind? All of that stuff. And that creates the form, because God uses materials very frugally. So it's the minimum use of materials to create the necessary form to pursue its task, which is a representation of the environmental forces around it, which is stressing upon it. So when I design something up to now, I've only been able to design the final item. So I'll only be able to design one tree, if you like, and I'll try and force that into different environments. Now we've got to a point in technology where we are cooperating with artificial intelligence. And what we can do is we can feed that artificial intelligence all kinds of environmental data where the thing we're creating is going to sit, and that will build the shape of what we're creating. So we're designing DNA as opposed to designing the final item. And that's only been able to happen in the last sort of 10 years. So what you end up with, amazingly and obviously, is lots of shapes that look like nature. Or if you look at what's in your house, it's vastly more simple than what's in your garden, visually. So when you look in your garden, you see plants and trees, and they're very complex visually. And the reason why is that they're efficient in the use of the material. So they're using their minimum material, and the forces around it are complex. So they're representing those complex forces in with the material that they're made from. Try not to be too complex, but the thing with it is that it's obvious. We've been staring at trees for all of our lives, and this is why they look the way they are. This is why they're different, because God is using a certain design methodology to create them. And now we can do that. So
can you give me some examples of things that we've created then in that spirit, using the artificial intelligence?
Well, there's just recently been created a rocket engine in that way, which is hyper efficient. And Well, I mean, we're just moving into it now, to be honest. But this is the design movement, actually, that architecture is moving into now. This is why it's, again, another reason why it's an Esther moment, because we're moving into that kind of technology. The world is doing it. The world's trying to do everything that God's done because they're realizing that what they've done doesn't work. We're trying to force a square peg into a round hole. So now they're coming to the point where they're using God's material choices because they realize that no other material choices work with nature. They're using God's system. So in the last 10 years, we've been looking at something called the circular economy, which is to try and make the waste of one process the raw materials for another, like a forest. And we've been looking at, okay, we need to use efficient use of materials. So we're going to have to design with DNA like God does. We're going to have to design it so that in that environment, it is the minimum use of material because we can't afford anymore to waste material on creating it. So we're going down by necessity to start designing like God. But what they're missing is they're missing the ability to sit down with him and talk to him. So all that's going to happen if they don't do that is that they're going to end up in a pot full of mess.
I
like
mean,
we did last time.
You know, I recently finished a book by Eric Metaxas called "Is Atheism Dead?" And in that, he quotes several examples of people like Isaac Newton and other kind of genius scientists from the past, and he quotes from their journals showing how intimately their faith informed their practice, their science. And that was, you know, people have said in the past that the reason the Western world developed the science in the way that it did is because of the God that gave birth to the thinkers who created and saw science in the way they did. We're at a juncture where it seems that we have we're turning back to creation again and going, what can we learn from it? But we're not doing it through the same spirit of worship, but again through the spirit of human necessity. We're running out of materials. We need to solve a problem that we've got. So again, it won't get as far as we want it to get because we're looking and copying, but we're not giving glory to, we're not worshiping God as he should be.
Yeah, and we'll create the wrong things. You know, you can have all of the ability to create in the world, but if you're aiming at the wrong target, you know, if you're creating a incredibly efficient abortion clinics or, you know, whatever, if you're creating very efficient guns to kill lots of civilians, or you know, I'm not saying that all gun creation is wrong, by the way, but you're aiming at the wrong targets.
In your book as well, you talk about some things that for me sound like they're bordering on science fiction, but that we're at the stage of developing, learning from God's creation as well, things like self-assembly and self-healing in creation that we're then learning to mimic. Can you what is that?
Yes. So, I mean, it's all come out of the ability. Have you heard of 3D printing? Everyone kind of hears of this thing, 3D printing, which brings everyone back to like the Terminator, where that.
Yeah, and most people go, great. I don't know what I'd ever want to create. Apart from people like you who go, you show me some of the things that you've printed, and they look incredible. Yes.
Well, the thing with it is, so what this is another thing. So all of these things, this is what I mean the last 10 years. So 3D printing is the printing of something 3D in layers. That's what it is. But it's the same way that God uses a paper wasp. So a paper wasp creates his nest by creating it in layers. And, you know, it's the same principle as spider silk. A spider shoots the silk out of its, you know, well, I do know, but I've forgotten. A spindle.
I thought you were going to say bum.
Yeah, that's it. But it wasn't very technical. Spider spinneret. That's it. And a bee, you know, creates the hive. So 3D printing is happening in nature. God never used the manufacturing techniques that we were using before, which were shove something in a mold, and then get it out the mold. You know, that or heat or get a lump of material and hack at it until we create something. God's never used those. So we've started to use the manufacturing methodologies that God uses. So what that does is it opens up a ton of ability for us to create new things, like these complex forms that we create, you know, in this new way. So, you know, the kind of form you'd never be able to manufacture a tree or the shape of a tree 10 years ago because it's too complex. You can't shove a tree in a mold, but you can 3D print a tree. So self-assembly, all of these things, which is the use of what you're doing is you're 3D printing certain materials into a structure which holds memory. So if you imagine, so it's called shape memory alloy or shape memory polymer. What you can do is you can 3D print that in, and it holds certain memories about what shapes it used to be. And then you can activate those memories. So imagine if you have a jumper which you wear the first time, it sets the memory of your shape, and then you wash it, and it might over time become looser or whatever. But as it comes back to your shape, the sweat on your body wicks it precisely to the shape that you are, because it remembers where it should be. And also in that jumper, you have vents, whereby when you're hot, the vents will open because the shape, the material that's used to make the vent remembers its open position, and suddenly, if it gets too hot, will open. So
is this something we've created?
Yeah. MIT Media Lab, mate, they're awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, so
sounds
this
like
is
something out of Back to the Future too. We put that jacket on.
Yeah, that's it. This is the thing. So like even it will get thicker, like in the winter, it will go thinner in the summer.
When you say memory, though, it's not like a conscious thought. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, it physically remembers. It will return to a certain shape that you've set it to in the past.
Okay.
So in that sense, it's got a memory.
Okay, so like programming it.
Yeah, that's it. Programmable material is what they say.
Oh, okay.
Which is, I mean, think about in your skin. So, your skin when it's cold, when it's hot, your hairs rise to release heat, and when it's cold, your capillaries will move away from the skin to conserve heat. So you're an adaptive being, and what that allows us to do is to create products that adapt over their life, so that you don't have to chuck them away.
Wow.
So it plays back into the circular economy thing, into the circular waste systems thing. The less you have to chuck away, the better for the environment that you're chucking it into, no matter what it is. So if you have a jumper which adapts to every shape, that you've become over your life, you don't need to keep buying jumpers. So it all plays into, it creates peace in our environments. It creates what God intended. Everything kind of working together symbiotically.
And you mentioned obviously the values of 3D printing. You alluded to something in your book that I saw on YouTube afterwards, that we can now 3D print houses.
Yes.
Because that's learning from wasps, as well as, among other things, the way they built these houses. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think God sees a difference between a tree and a flower. It's just species and scale. So we have these different divisions of architecture, product design, and we make these things to say, right, a building is a completely different thing to, say, a consumer product. But God uses exactly the same principles to form a blade of grass than he does to form an oak tree. So 3D printing a house is pretty much the same as 3D printing a phone case. It's just scale is the only different thing. So yes, we are. I mean,
even the shape of the houses that they saw look different to the type of ones that we're used to living in, because again, they're learning different lessons from their environment and from the way that you can 3D print a house for maximum efficiency, I guess, is it?
Yeah. So what they're learning is what is obvious in nature, which is that cubes aren't structurally advantageous. So they have to, if they're going to be
Why
efficient.
do we build houses in cubes then?
Because it's an ideology.
Or is it just easier?
No, we've made it easier.
Oh, right.
So what happened is, in the Modernist movement, we started to create things in cubes because it represented simplicity, and simplicity leads into progress. So we ended up with cubes. I mean, there are benefits. It gives a lot of space to an area. But you have to, because they're not structurally advantageous, you have to add lots of material to make it structurally stable. Whereas you won't really find many cubes in nature. You might find a few cubes in the creation of salt. Salt is at its microscopic level is a cube, but there's really very few, because God doesn't like to use too much material. So he'll build something like a blade of grass so that it's in a conical shape, so that it doesn't have to have a structure around it to keep it up. Have you noticed how little material is used in a blade of grass, but how structurally, it stands up by itself? That's because the geometry of it is structurally advantageous. So there's certain things that are obvious that we're kind of learning now, because I think that the point is that we've always, because we haven't looked at nature as being designed, we're kind of resistant to trying to copy its design, because it might lead us back into theism. So if we admit that we've been constantly shouting the line for, as a society, that there is no God, God doesn't exist, that the world was by chance, I think there might be a bit of fear that when we start to copy nature and realize that it works, that actually it might reveal that there is an intelligent creator. So I think it's all leads back to that problem. Wow. But now they haven't got a choice. It's by necessity that we've stopped saying, right, I feel like I want to design a house that is a cube, and somebody turns around and says, right, well, how much material are you using to do that? Because we're actually having to reduce the amount of material that we're using now. And then you start to say, right, we can't build it in that way because it just isn't the best way of building it. So they're coming to God's creative methodologies by necessity. And yeah, that throws up lots of interesting questions, like what is the difference between art and design, which I think becomes more distinguished when you're having to design efficiently. So when you're creating things which are functional, you have to do it in a very efficient way. God's so consistent in the way that he does it, that most of what he creates is complex looking because it's efficient. So where does that put art? Because I want to express myself in creating something which is like wasteful, beautiful, and I think that you end up kind of separating them even more and more, to say, right, we need art. It's something that we require, and it's a necessary tool in a culture to ask questions of the culture. If you see good art, it'll jolt you a bit and ask you a question of, is this really what this is, or why is this thing? It's a mode of inquiry. So we need art, but I think we need to separate that from the creation of functional things, because we just don't have the resource to waste.
Wow.
We're seeing the results of it. So
wow. I mean, you asked just then, have I ever looked at a blade of grass and considered those questions of efficiency? And I thought, no, I haven't. I've never. But this is what you're doing. And actually, I think what your challenge is, that this is what we should be doing as students of our master. If we redeem our vision of creation to see it as something God did intentionally with will and purpose behind, then actually as disciples and students of the Lord, we don't just look at the book of God, but the book of nature to learn about him and his ways as well, which I think is really beautiful and a really important challenge to the church. Like you said, the counter-Reformation movement that has so emphasized the inner spiritual dimension of Christianity, that it is about just learning to obey Jesus' commands. Disciples obey Jesus' commands. Whereas actually, no, disciples learn to obey the master, and the master is also the God who gave Adam that commission in the garden to go and cultivate the earth, steward, care for it, subdue it, all of that. And it's the same God. So I think there's a really important challenges that the church needs to hear, but then also every Christian, whatever vocation or sphere they're in, industry they're in, to think carefully, conscientiously, prayerfully about what God is calling them to do and how the fact of their faith is going to uniquely help them. Whereas we've for so long separated out what I do from what I believe in this kind of fact and value split that again is a kind of post-enlightenment hangover. Whereas actually, I think what you're saying is we need to make sure they're not just back together, but we're so integrated as beings that we bring our values, our inner life of faith in God, into the real world that informs everything that we do. So I think it's a really healthy, really important challenge. Jake, we're running out of time because there's just so much in here. I love there's so many little throwaways that I want to go back to and re-listen. You know, objects disciple us, things like that. Brilliant. That the church and pastors should learn from as well, and how we conceive of and can think about our church services. But anyway, before we finish, what else is in your heart or mind that you just want to share with us, maybe as a challenge or as encouragement before we conclude?
Yes. Primarily, God needs to be worshipped in this way. That's, if nothing else, he needs to be worshipped in his entirety. And God is primarily praised in heaven for being the creator of the universe. If you read through scriptures, he is worthy, for he has created all things. You know, so.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, I'll come back. I'll let you carry on the thought. But as you said it reminds me, just reading Mike Reeves' book on the fear of God. And he says in scripture, the fear of God, like the awe and wonder at who God is both about creation, but then also about the cross. And I think it's the wisdom of God in creation, the wisdom of God in redemption. And I think in our churches, we're very good at singing songs about the wisdom of God in redemption and the marvel of the cross. We never want to undermine that. But I think, you know, as you're alluding to and going to carry on in your answer when I stop interrupting you, is actually the wisdom of God in creation really needs to be recovered. Carry on.
Yeah, I think we've learned to know God as Father, but he is first creator. And you learn about God as Father when you study him as creator as well. So I just see that this is a massive area. You know, when you talk to somebody who doesn't know God, you almost get kind of jolted out of like knowing him as Father to talk about him as creator. Because that's their question, is like, is he creator? That's their first question. Their second question is then, you know, okay, is he good? Is he Father? But we don't really, in our day to day, we encounter him as Father, but we don't really pursue him as creator. And I don't think, in honesty, and because we've been limited by technology as well, but also because of these theological kind of dynamics that we've had, I don't think as a church we've ever moved into properly worshipping him as creator. But all of heaven is. You know, all of heaven is worshipping God as creator and declaring his works, which are the bumblebee and the flower and the you know, the hawk and the eye. All of these things are God's works. So primarily, I think we need a new awareness of the intricacies of God and the magnificence of God as creator. So that's probably what I'd leave it with, which I think is relevant to anyone, whether you're a creator yourself or everyone's creative. Everyone has to create something. But I think that's relevant to everyone, that he needs to be worshipped in this way.
Beautiful. Well, I love your mind and the way that you see the world and think about the world, and really commend all that you're pursuing, and really looking forward to hearing and seeing all that God's going to use you to do and create. Thanks for your time today, Jake.
Thanks for yours, brother. And thank you so much. You've really been a great encouragement to me. And you're just a flipping awesome dude. So
I'll make sure I keep that bit in the podcast.
Yes.